She never wore a crown, yet she met her death like a queen. Princess Élisabeth of France chose loyalty over freedom, faith over fear, and love over life itself. When the revolution demanded royal blood, she refused to flee, walking calmly to the guillotine with a prayer on her lips. This is the story of the princess who died not for power, but for devotion. Born on May 3, 1764, at the Palace of Versailles, Elisabeth Philippine Marie-Hélène de France entered a world of dazzling chandeliers and cold marble corridors. A world where everything glittered except certainty. She was the youngest child of Louis, Dauphin of France, and Maria Josepha of Saxony. But she would never know the warmth of her parents for long. Her father, heir to the throne, died of consumption when Elisabeth was only 3 years old. Her mother followed 2 years later. Orphaned before she could even write her name, she was raised by her aunts, the daughters of Louis XV, who kept her within the polished but lonely walls of court. The Versailles of Elisabeth's childhood was an illusion of harmony. Behind the perfume and protocol hid decay and distrust. The monarchy still shimmered, but the foundations had begun to crack. Elisabeth's siblings were each marked for destiny. Her eldest brother, Louis Auguste, would become Louis XVI. Another brother, Provence, would later rule as Louis XIV, and the youngest, Artois, would become Charles X. All would wear crowns burdened by guilt, exile, or blood. But Elisabeth, the quiet sister, seemed destined for a different fate. One without thrones or heirs, a fate written in prayer and silence. She was not the beauty of the family, nor the political pawn many expected her to be. The court whispered that she was too serious, too devout, too detached from the games of ambition that spun the palace like a jeweled cage. While others sought influence and favor, she spent hours in the chapel, her hands folded, her lips murmuring Latin hymns, while sunlight traced patterns through the stained glass. She studied theology and mathematics, loved animals, and found joy in charity. Her tutors spoke of a girl with piercing intelligence, yet utterly indifferent to her own future. A contradiction both angelic and dangerous in a world built on vanity. Her piety was not naive. It was a defense. Versailles, for all its splendor, was also a school of cruelty. Beneath the silks and powdered wigs, people clawed for recognition. Every glance, every dance, every whispered remark could make or unmake a life. Elisabeth learned early that silence was power, that gentleness could be armor. When courtiers mocked her simplicity, she smiled. When they gossiped about her plain gowns and refusal to flirt, she said only that she served a higher king. In a century rushing toward reason and revolution, she stood like a figure carved from an older faith. Yet even a saint is not spared from longing. Elisabeth once dreamed of marriage, of a husband chosen not by treaty, but by affection. For a time, the court discussed alliances, perhaps with a Spanish or Sardinian prince. But as her brothers solidified their rule, plans shifted. Her devotion made her seem unsuited to diplomacy. Her refusal to leave France marked her as stubborn. When one proposal was finally dismissed, she is said to have smiled with relief. "God does not want me anywhere else," she told her confessor. From that day on, she called herself the Bride of Christ and abandoned all dreams of earthly crowns. Outside Versailles, the world was beginning to burn. The price of bread rose. The air itself seemed heavy with discontent. Philosophers mocked the church, pamphleteers whispered of liberty, equality, fraternity, words that thrilled the starving and terrified the privileged. But inside the palace, Elisabeth moved like a calm light through the chaos. She nursed the sick, gave her jewelry to the poor, and prayed for those who insulted her family. The servants adored her. The poor called her the Angel of Versailles. Her faith was not the hollow ritual of the court. It was a living, breathing devotion. Still, the storm could not be ignored forever. Each carriage arriving from Paris brought darker news. Crowds had gathered in the streets, effigies of nobles burned by night. Even the courtiers began to sense that the old world was dying. But Elisabeth never trembled. She believed that if she kept faith, if she stayed true to her brother and her God, then no revolution could touch her soul. In 1774, when her brother Louis became king, Elisabeth was 10. She watched as the crown was placed upon his young, uncertain head, and she felt, perhaps for the first time, that her destiny was tied to his. Where others saw a monarch, she saw the shy boy who had comforted her after their mother's death, who shared her prayers in the quiet corners of Versailles. He was no tyrant, only a man overwhelmed by a crown he had never wanted. And she would love him, fiercely, loyally to the end. While other courtiers drifted toward intrigue or exile, Elisabeth anchored herself beside her brother and his new queen, Marie Antoinette. The young Austrian was dazzling and careless, a creature of laughter and silk, everything Elisabeth was not. Yet, instead of jealousy, she offered understanding. She would later write that she saw in Marie Antoinette a heart capable of love, but lost in glitter. The two women would become bound by tragedy, the devout and the decadent, united not by politics, but by suffering. At 16, Elisabeth was already being called Madame Elisabeth, a title of respect and restraint. But beneath it lay an unspoken truth. She would never marry, never reign, never escape the orbit of her family. Her fate was sealed not by sin, but by virtue. And history, with its cruel symmetry, would one day punish her for it. The palace that raised her would soon become her prison. The marble floors she once crossed in prayer would echo with soldiers' boots. But in those early years, she could not know that her quiet devotion, the very thing that set her apart, was the spark that would carry her all the way to the guillotine. If Elisabeth of France had been born in another age, her tenderness might have led to a peaceful life of charity and contemplation. But her love, pure, steadfast, and unpolitical, was destined to collide with history. From childhood, her brother Louis was not just a sibling to her. He was her anchor, the only remnant of family in a palace of masks. When he ascended the throne in 1774, she was still a child, watching the gentle boy who had once held her hand in prayer now bear the weight of an empire. That moment carved something unbreakable into her heart. Devotion not to the crown, but to the man who wore it. Louis XV was awkward, kind, and uncertain, qualities that courtiers mistook for weakness, but Elisabeth saw as grace. He was not made for tyranny. He was made for sincerity. In his clumsy patience, she recognized the same fragility she felt within herself. When others whispered about his indecision, she defended him. When pamphlets mocked his piety, she prayed harder for him. To Elisabeth, loyalty was not an act of duty. It was the language of love. Her brother's marriage to Marie Antoinette in 1770 brought both joy and complexity. The young Austrian archduchess entered Versailles like a storm of perfume and laughter. Her taste for amusement, masked balls, theater, extravagant gowns, clashed with Elisabeth's simplicity. The courtiers quickly divided into camps, those who adored the dazzling queen and those who despised her foreign airs. Elisabeth, caught in between, tried to be the quiet bridge between faith and frivolity. She saw Marie Antoinette not as a rival, but as another lonely soul trapped by protocol and expectation. In a letter to a confidant, she wrote, "The Queen has the heart of a child. I pray she learns the strength to bear her crown." Over time, an unspoken sisterhood grew between them. Marie Antoinette began to rely on Elisabeth's calmness as the court's gossip turned crueler. She would visit her for counsel, for silence, for warmth that politics could not provide. And when the Queen bore her first child, Elisabeth was there, her hands trembling as she held the infant who symbolized both hope and peril for the Bourbon line. But beneath these tender moments, the air of France was thickening with suspicion. People were starving while Versailles glittered. The king's benevolence could not compete with bread riots. And though Elisabeth lived modestly, her very existence, her jewels, her carriage, her palace walls, was seen as part of a decaying order. She gave away her allowance to convents and the poor, but charity could not silence revolution. Her love for her brother was tested when advisors urged her to marry abroad. A marriage alliance might have offered her safety, a life beyond the coming storm. Louis himself gently encouraged her to consider it. Yet Elisabeth refused. "Would you have me abandon you, sire, when the ship begins to sink?" she asked softly. "No, my place is beside you." The king wept. For a moment, he was not a ruler, but a brother, watching his sister choose ruin over rescue. From then on, Elisabeth's loyalty became her defining mark. She was at every royal family dinner, every private mass, every anxious council where the air trembled with fear of rebellion. When pamphleteers mocked the royal family as parasites, she stood taller beside them, serene in the face of insult. While others whispered of fleeing to Austria or Spain, she spoke of trust, trust in providence, trust in duty, trust that the French people would remember their faith. Her correspondence from these years reveals the depth of her conviction. "I would rather die with my family," she wrote, "than live without them." It was not martyrdom she sought, but unity. She believed that the monarchy, flawed though it was, still carried a sacred duty, a covenant between ruler and ruled. And she saw her brother not as a sovereign trapped by politics, but as a man burdened by conscience. When he agonized over decisions, she would kneel beside him and whisper, "God does not abandon those who seek peace." The revolution, however, had no patience for peace. By 1788, pamphlets calling for equality spread faster than prayers. Rumors of corruption painted the royal family as enemies of the people. Versailles became less a symbol of glory and more a gilded prison. Through it all, Elisabeth remained at her brother's side, often unseen but always present, a figure of quiet strength in the background of every crisis. Witnesses spoke of how she would tend to her brother's children, teaching them catechism, leading them in prayer. The Dauphin, a frail boy, adored his Aunt Elisabeth, calling her "my holy aunt." To him, she was safety in a world growing darker each day. To the Queen, she was conscience, the reminder of faith in a palace that was losing it. Yet the tenderness of these domestic scenes only made what followed more tragic. The closer Elisabeth clung to her family, the more inseparable she became from their doom. By loving them too fiercely, she chained herself to their downfall. When whispers of rebellion reached Versailles, courtiers began to vanish. Friends fled to foreign courts. Ministers resigned. But Elisabeth stayed, praying each morning at the same hour, tending to her duties, and watching the gardens that once bloomed with peace now echo with the sound of marching feet. To those who urged her to go, to hide, to seek refuge in a convent, she gave a single answer: "Where my brother is, there is my home." That love, once her light, was about to become her sentence. For when revolution came, it would not distinguish between kings and those who loved them. It would not care for purity, piety, or prayer. And Elisabeth, the quiet sister who had refused to leave, would soon find herself standing in the very center of a nation's fury. By the late 1780s, the air of France was no longer sweet with the perfume of Versailles. It stank of hunger, anger, and despair. The kingdom that had once dazzled Europe with its splendor was rotting from within. Fields lay barren after harsh winters. Bread prices soared, and even the devout began to question divine right when their children starved in the streets. Pamphlets, once whispered in taverns, now thundered across Paris. Liberty, equality, fraternity. 3 words that promised salvation, but also reeked of vengeance. And in the midst of it all, Princess Élisabeth remained at Versailles, as if faith alone could keep the storm at bay. Louis XVI, mild by nature and uncertain by design, believed reform might calm the fury. He recalled the Estates General in 1789, hoping dialogue could heal what pride had broken. But when the commoners, the Third Estate, declared themselves the National Assembly, the monarchy's authority cracked like thin glass. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. The people had tasted defiance, and no crown could feed them now. Versailles, the heart of royal majesty, became a fortress under siege. Rumors flowed like poison through the city. That the queen hoarded grain, that the king plotted to flee, that the court feasted while the poor gnawed bones. None of it mattered whether true or false. Anger had already replaced reason. Elisabeth watched these changes not with political eyes, but with a soul that sensed the moral collapse behind them. She could feel the pulse of fear in every corridor, the tremor of servants, the soft sound of gates being bolted at night. She prayed longer each day, her rosary beads worn thin between her fingers. Yet even as the world seemed to dissolve, she never lost her calm. "The will of God is my peace," she said to her maid one evening as the mob's chants echoed from the distance. The first true blow came on July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. The fall of the ancient fortress was more than a military victory. It was the death of fear itself. The people had tasted royal blood metaphorically, and soon they would crave it, literally. The news reached Versailles like thunder. Ministers panicked, courtiers whispered of flight, and Marie Antoinette clutched her children as though she could stop time. But Elisabeth stood still at the chapel door, watching the candles tremble in the draught, whispering a psalm of mercy for a nation that no longer believed in mercy. In the weeks that followed, the monarchy's dignity began to unravel thread by thread. The guards grew restless, soldiers murmured about the people's cause, and the court's lavish ceremonies felt grotesque in contrast to the hunger outside its gates. Yet Elisabeth's daily life remained unchanged. She visited hospitals, sent alms to parishes, and wrote letters filled not with panic, but compassion. To one friend she confessed, "The times are dreadful, yet I see the hand of Providence. Perhaps France must fall to rise again." But history has little patience for saints. On the night of October 5th, 1789, the storm broke. Thousands of women from Paris, armed with pikes and fury, marched toward Versailles demanding bread. It was a march of desperation turned revolution. Rain fell hard, mixing with mud and curses as they shouted for justice and for the Queen's head. At dawn, they reached the palace. Guards tried to hold them back, but the gates burst open. The mob flooded the marble halls, dripping with rain and rage. Some carried torches, others dragged corpses of royal guards. They tore through gilded rooms, shouting, "Where is the Austrian woman?" Marie Antoinette barely escaped assassination, fleeing half-dressed to the king's chambers. Elisabeth, hearing the chaos, rushed toward her brother instead of hiding. She found him pale but calm, his trembling hands clutching a crucifix. "We must go to them," she said, her voice steady. And she did, walking with him onto the balcony to face the roaring crowd. It was not courage born of politics, but of compassion. She looked at the sea of faces, women with hollow cheeks, men with bloodied hands, children crying in the rain, and whispered, "My God, forgive them. They know not what they do." The crowd, seeing the royal family appear, howled for bread and justice. The king promised to go to Paris, and that single promise saved their lives for one more day. The next morning, the royal family, Louis, Antoinette, their children, and Elisabeth, were escorted to the capital. The road to Paris was lined with shouts and mockery, the heads of their slain guards raised on pikes. The golden carriage, once a symbol of majesty, now looked like a coffin on wheels. As the Palace of Versailles disappeared behind them, Elisabeth turned once to look back. Witnesses said she made the sign of the cross, murmuring softly, "God's house is no longer ours." They arrived at the Tuileries Palace, a once grand residence now turned prison in all but name. Soldiers surrounded the gates. Mobs filled the streets. Each window was a reminder that they were being watched. And yet, inside those walls, Elisabeth kept her routine. Morning prayers, tending to the children, comforting the queen, and reading the scriptures. The others despaired. She radiated serenity. Marie Antoinette once said of her, "She is our angel. If we had her faith, we would not fear death." Outside, pamphlets began to call her Madame Devote, mocking her religiosity. Revolutionaries saw in her purity not innocence, but defiance. Her virtue became political. And so, the woman who had done nothing but love her brother was now counted among the enemies of the people. As 1790 dawned, France was no longer a monarchy in spirit, only in form. The National Assembly redefined the laws, the church was stripped of its power, nobles fled across borders. The king hesitated, the queen grew bitter, and Elisabeth prayed harder. She believed the storm could still pass, that France might rediscover its soul. But revolutions, once awakened, never go back to sleep. The storm had only begun, and for Elisabeth, its eye would soon move directly above her heart. By 1790, the Palace of the Tuileries was no longer a home. It was a gilded cage surrounded by the noise of revolution. The royal family lived under the watch of armed guards who called themselves patriots. Every window faced suspicion, every door led to whispers. Crowds gathered daily outside the gates, chanting, "Down with the tyrants," and "Death to the Austrian." Their hatred aimed at Marie Antoinette, their contempt extending to anyone who stood beside her. Elisabeth of France stood beside her always. She had refused every chance to flee, every plea from friends to hide in safety. To her, loyalty was not a word, but a vow. "My duty," she said quietly to her maid, "is where my family stands. And if that is in chains, then I am chained gladly." Those words would echo through every room she touched. Rooms filled not with the scent of roses, but of fear and stale bread. Life inside the Tuileries moved in strange rhythm, half royal ceremony, half imprisonment. The family dined together each evening, pretending the world beyond the palace walls still respected their names. Louis XV read to his children by candlelight. The queen sewed in silence. Elisabeth prayed softly, her rosary gliding through her fingers as if time itself could be held together by faith. Yet outside, the city was starving, the voices of anger rising higher each day. The monarchy had become a living ghost that France could not bear to see or to bury. There were nights when the mob gathered so close that the sound of their chants entered the royal chambers like a storm. Marie Antoinette would hold her son, trembling. Louis would stand motionless, listening. Elizabeth alone would move, crossing the room to light more candles, as though she could fight darkness with light. To the frightened servants, her calmness was a miracle. She was the only one among them who never cried, one later recalled. The guards assigned to the Tuileries were mostly revolutionaries, young men, many barely literate, hardened by hunger and propaganda. Some mocked the royals, others secretly pitied them. One guard, years later, told how Elizabeth would greet them each morning with kindness, offering bread from her own plate. "She looked at us," he said, "as if we were still men, not monsters." But pity was a fragile shield. The royal family's imprisonment deepened. They could no longer walk in the gardens freely. Their letters were censored, their visitors questioned. The Queen's every gesture was interpreted as conspiracy. Rumors claimed that she and Elizabeth plotted with foreign monarchs to destroy France. The people who once cheered their carriages now sharpened knives in their names. Through all this, Elizabeth's devotion to her brother only grew. Louis was breaking under the pressure, torn between conscience and survival, faith and fear. He read political essays by day and scripture by night, unable to reconcile the two. At times, he would weep quietly in the library, his face buried in his hands. Elizabeth would sit beside him, saying nothing, only resting her hand on his arm until he found strength to breathe again. "You were not chosen for glory," she told him once, "but for sacrifice." In the Queen's eyes, Elizabeth was a saint. In the King's, she was the last mirror of peace. But to the revolutionaries, she was a symbol of everything the old world represented: piety, obedience, and monarchy. Even her gentleness became suspect. When she attended Mass in secret with non-juring priests, those who refused to swear loyalty to the revolutionary government, she was watched, reported, and denounced as an enemy of the people. "She prays against the Republic," one guard wrote in his journal. Perhaps she did. Or perhaps she prayed only for France to remember mercy. Outside the palace, France was devouring itself. The church had been nationalized, its property seized. The clergy were divided. The faithful were torn between conscience and survival. Elizabeth's faith, once seen as virtue, was now political defiance. And yet, she never hid it. She attended confession whenever she could, wrote letters of comfort to imprisoned priests, and risked punishment to smuggle aid to nuns who had been driven from their convents. The Queen admired her courage, but not her calmness. Marie Antoinette, once the glittering heart of Versailles, was now a woman haunted by loss. She would pace the corridors late at night, her face pale, her eyes burning with sleeplessness. "They hate me," she whispered to Elizabeth, "and soon they will kill us all." Elizabeth answered quietly, "Then let us die well." In 1791, the royal children began to notice their world shrinking. The young Dauphin, only 6 years old, asked why the soldiers never smiled anymore. "Because they are afraid," Elizabeth told him gently, "and people who fear cannot love." She became more than an aunt. She became a second mother, teaching the children to pray for those who cursed them, to forgive even when they did not understand. Yet, forgiveness did not stop the tide. By early 1791, the Tuileries had become unbearable. Spies filled the servants' quarters, and each meal felt like a trial. Louis XVI, hesitant but desperate, began to consider escape. The idea had been whispered before: flee Paris, reach loyal troops near Montmédy, and negotiate from safety. But the king had always refused to abandon his people. Now, he began to see that he no longer had any. When plans for flight were discussed, Elisabeth's response was simple. If my brother goes, I go. If he stays, I stay. She would not save herself without him. Her loyalty was both her halo and her chain. Outside, the storm was turning into a flood. Paris was no longer a city of citizens, but a theater of accusation. In the clubs and cafes, orators shouted of treason. In the squares, effigies of the king burned. Even the children in the streets sang songs of hatred. Inside the Tuileries, Elisabeth prayed harder. Each dawn, she would kneel before the small crucifix she had brought from Versailles and whisper, "Fiat voluntas tua," thy will be done. To those who saw her, it seemed she was made of something beyond fear. But deep within, she surely knew the truth, that her prayers were not for deliverance, but for courage. The family's hope, fragile as glass, rested on one desperate plan: the flight to Montmédy. Elisabeth never spoke of it aloud, yet in her eyes, those who served her saw a quiet resolve. She knew that even if they escaped, the revolution would follow them wherever they ran. There are storms one cannot outrun, only endure. The walls of the Tuileries echoed that truth each night as the crowd outside sang their revolutionary hymns. And inside, in the dim glow of a single candle, Elisabeth of France whispered her final prayers for peace, unaware that her devotion and her refusal to flee alone would soon lead her straight toward the guillotine. By the spring of 1791, the walls of the Tuileries had grown tighter, as though the air itself had turned to stone. Each step the royal family took echoed under watchful eyes. The guards no longer hid their contempt. The crowds outside shouted insults even when the king's children appeared at the windows. Every letter, every conversation, every prayer was spied upon. The monarchy was a cage, and Paris had become the warden. Louis XVI, usually patient to a fault, could bear it no longer. He still believed that beyond the city's suffocating grip lay loyal France, the soldiers at Montmédy, the peasants who still loved their king, the nobility who had fled but could return with foreign aid. Perhaps from there, in safety, he could restore order and protect his family. The plan was dangerous, but desperation had no patience for wisdom. It was the Queen, Marie Antoinette, who pressed the hardest. She wanted to save their children, to save her husband's dignity. Yet even she hesitated when the plan was laid bare. They would flee Paris disguised as commoners, traveling in secret by carriage through the night, bound for the fortress of Montmédy near the border. If they succeeded, France might be saved. If they failed, there would be no second chance. When the king told Elisabeth of the plan, she listened quietly. "Do you wish me to stay?" she asked. Louis hesitated. "I would have you safe," he replied. She shook her head. "Then I will go with you." In those simple words lay the weight of her character. Loyalty even when escape meant betrayal in the eyes of the people. She packed lightly, taking only a rosary, a small portrait of her brother, and a crucifix. "These are my jewels now," she said to her maid. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the escape began. The palace was cloaked in uneasy silence. One by one they slipped away, the king disguised as a valet, the queen as a governess, Elisabeth as her maid. The royal children were dressed as girls of the household. Outside, the streets of Paris were thick with shadows, and only the faint sound of hooves broke the air. For a few precious hours, freedom seemed possible. The carriage rattled northward under a pale moon. Inside, the family whispered prayers, their hearts beating with both fear and fragile hope. Elisabeth held the youngest child in her arms, rocking him gently as he slept, murmuring psalms. She watched her brother's face by lantern light, tired, lined, but still carrying the soft dignity that no crown could erase. She wanted to believe they were being led by providence, that God had chosen this road for their deliverance. But deliverance was not waiting at the end of it. The journey moved too slowly. The carriage was heavy, its horses overburdened. The king's insistence on bringing attendants and supplies betrayed their disguise. At each stop, curious villagers stared too long, whispered too much. By morning, word had already begun to spread that something was wrong, that these travelers were no commoners. At Saint-Ménehould, a postmaster recognized Louis XVI from his portrait on the new currency. He sent riders ahead to Varennes, the next town, warning that the royal family was fleeing. As dusk fell, the carriage entered the narrow streets of Varennes, and the trap closed. Barricades blocked the road, and the dim light of lanterns revealed armed citizens standing shoulder to shoulder. "Who goes there?" a voice shouted. The king hesitated. His disguise meant nothing now. The crowd surged forward, torches flaring. Someone cried, "It is the king!" Chaos followed. The family was forced out of the carriage, surrounded by soldiers and jeering townspeople. The mayor was summoned, the situation debated through the night. Elisabeth stood close to her brother, whispering prayers as insults rained upon them. The queen tried to plead for her children. The Dauphin began to cry. Louis, pale and broken, could only say, "We are your king and queen. We have done nothing to harm you." But his words carried no weight anymore. At dawn, they were ordered to return to Paris, not as rulers, but as prisoners. The long road back became a funeral march for the monarchy. Crowds lined the route, spitting, shouting, laughing. The soldiers guarding the carriage would not allow the windows to be closed. The people had to see their fallen masters. The same journey that had begun with hope now crawled under humiliation. Elisabeth did not weep. She sat between the queen and the children, murmuring prayers that mingled with the sound of the mob. When one soldier insulted the queen, Elisabeth looked at him and said gently, "Do not speak thus. You will need forgiveness one day too." Witnesses recalled that he turned his eyes away in shame. When they reached Paris, the silence was more terrible than noise. The people no longer shouted, they stared. It was the gaze of judgment, cold and final. Above the city gates hung banners that read, "The King of the French has returned to his people." But everyone knew the truth. The people had taken their king captive. Back inside the Tuileries, the locks were changed, the guards doubled, and the family stripped of the last illusion of freedom. The failed escape had destroyed any sympathy the nation might have had. Even moderate revolutionaries now called for the end of the monarchy. In the assembly, voices rose demanding trial, punishment, death. Elisabeth understood at once what her brother did not yet grasp, that there would be no forgiveness. She comforted him when he despaired, tended to the queen's tears, and calmed the frightened children. To one servant, she said, "The hand of God has brought us back. If it is His will that we suffer, then we must suffer with dignity." Her composure astonished everyone. But she was no longer the shy girl of Versailles. The revolution had carved her into something harder, purer, a living symbol of loyalty in an age of betrayal. The king's subjects no longer saw her as a princess. To them, she was an accomplice of tyranny. To history, she would become something else entirely. A woman who chose devotion over deliverance, and whose prayers would echo long after the gates of the Tuileries closed forever. In the months that followed, Elisabeth no longer prayed for escape. She prayed for courage. She prayed for France. And she prayed that when the next storm came, as it surely would, she would face it as she always had, unshaken, unafraid, and faithful to the end. By the dawn of 1793, the Kingdom of France no longer existed. Only a republic built on fear and suspicion. The cries of liberty had curdled into shouts for blood. The streets of Paris reeked of smoke and death, and the guillotine, standing proudly in the Place de la Révolution, had become both judge and God. The revolution that had promised freedom now demanded sacrifice, and the first to be offered was the man once called king. Louis XVI, Elisabeth's gentle, indecisive brother, had been imprisoned with his family in the Temple Tower since August 1792, after the monarchy was officially abolished. The royal arms had been stripped from their gates, their servants dismissed, their very names erased. He was now citizen Capet, a man without a crown, without command, without dignity. Yet for Elisabeth, he was still her brother, the same boy who once read prayers beside her at Versailles, the man whose silence had never concealed his goodness. In those cold, stone walls, the family lived in a rhythm of sorrow. The guards mocked them. The food was rationed. Even the light through the barred windows seemed cruel. Still, Elisabeth's presence brought a kind of fragile peace. Each morning, she led prayers with the children, kneeling on the damp floor. The Queen, pale and hollow-eyed, clung to her faith, while Louis tried to comfort them all, speaking of providence and forgiveness. He no longer wore silk, only plain wool. Yet his gentleness gave him a quiet majesty that even his captors could not erase. When the convention, the new revolutionary assembly, announced his trial for treason, the verdict was already decided. The nation demanded a corpse, not a defense. Accused of conspiring against liberty, Louis stood calm before his judges. He denied the charges, not with arrogance, but with sorrow. "I forgive those who accuse me," he said. "I pray that my blood may cement the happiness of the French." The words only enraged them more. In the temple, Elisabeth waited with the others, listening for every sound from outside. The trial stretched for weeks. Each rumor brought new dread. She spent her nights kneeling before the crucifix, whispering, "If this cup cannot pass from him, let thy will be done." On January 20th, 1793, the decision came. Louis was sentenced to death. The guards brought him the decree with cold precision. The Queen collapsed in tears. The children clung to their father's knees. Elisabeth stood silent, her lips trembling, her rosary breaking under her fingers. The king raised his hand, calm as ever. "We must prepare ourselves," he said. "It is God's will." That evening, he asked to see his family one last time. The guards reluctantly agreed. The door opened, and the four faces he loved most rushed toward him: Marie Antoinette, their daughter Marie-Thérèse, the little Dauphin, and Elisabeth. The king took them all in his arms. No crown could have made him more royal than that moment. Witnesses later wrote that the room was filled with weeping so deep it felt like prayer. Louis tried to speak of courage, of faith, but his voice broke. "My sister," he said to Elisabeth, "you have always been my angel. Continue to support those I leave behind." She could not answer. She only took his hands and pressed them to her forehead, whispering, "We shall meet again in heaven." He left them before dawn, refusing to let them follow him to the courtyard. When the guards came to lead him away, Elisabeth fell to her knees. "My God," she murmured, "receive him as your servant, not as a king, but as a martyr." January 20, 1793, the morning of the execution. The air was sharp with frost. The city seemed to hold its breath. Louis rode to the scaffold in a plain carriage, accompanied by a priest. He prayed aloud, forgiving his enemies to the very end. At the Place de la Révolution, tens of thousands gathered to watch. Drums rolled to drown out his final words, but those near the scaffold heard him cry, "I die innocent. I pardon my enemies. May my blood never fall upon France." The blade fell. Inside the temple tower, Elisabeth felt the tremor before the sound reached her ears. The queen fainted. The children screamed. She did not cry. She stood very still, whispering to herself, "He is free." And then she sank to her knees and began to pray. That night, Paris celebrated with gunfire and drunken songs. The king's blood was washed from the cobblestones, his body thrown into an unmarked grave. The Republic had killed its monarch, and in doing so, had murdered its last shred of mercy. In the days that followed, the royal women were left in silence. Their rooms grew colder, the guards harsher. Marie Antoinette barely spoke, her eyes vacant with grief. Elisabeth became the caretaker of them all, comforting the children, reading the Psalms, speaking softly to the queen when she would not eat. "He has only gone before us," Elisabeth told her. "We will follow soon, and there will be no more sorrow." Her calmness disturbed even her captors. One guard, years later, confessed that he avoided her gaze because she looked at me as if I were already forgiven. The death of the king was meant to end the monarchy, but instead it turned Elisabeth into its living memory. She was now the last unbroken thread, the embodiment of loyalty, grace, and faith. Her brother had gone to the scaffold with dignity. She would one day follow him with the same peace. For now, she remained in the shadow of the guillotine, praying in the darkness of the temple, waiting for the revolution to remember her name and demand her blood too. After the execution of Louis XVI, silence ruled the temple tower, not peace, but the kind of silence that follows a death when the soul still lingers. The king's absence hung in the air like incense that would not fade. His chair remained untouched, his Bible still open where he had left it. The guards laughed louder now, drank harder, but even they seemed uneasy, as though they had slain not a man, but something sacred. For the women left behind, Marie Antoinette, her daughter Marie-Thérèse, and Madame Elisabeth, grief became a second prison. They were now widows of a lost world, bound together not by rank, but by suffering. The queen's beauty had withered into pallor, her hair turning white within weeks. She moved like a ghost, speaking little, her eyes sunken, but fierce. The young princess clung to Elisabeth for comfort, while Elisabeth herself became both nurse and nun within those walls, the quiet center of a collapsing universe. The guards, emboldened by victory, treated them with growing cruelty. Their meals were meager, their walks restricted. Spies reported every word they spoke. When the queen wept, they mocked her. When she prayed, they cursed. One night, when a drunken soldier sang the Carmagnole beneath their window, a mocking anthem celebrating the death of kings, Elisabeth closed the shutters and said softly, "Let him sing. Perhaps it is the only joy he has left." The queen no longer shared that serenity. Her heart was broken, her pride shattered. Every moment was torment. The memory of her husband's calm on the scaffold, the image of his blood darkening the wood. She clutched their son, the young Dauphin. as though her arms could protect him from history. But history had already chosen its next victim. In July 1793, under orders from the Committee of Public Safety, the guards entered their cell at night. The command was brutal and precise. The queen was to be separated from her son. No explanation, no mercy. Marie Antoinette screamed as they dragged the boy from her arms. "He needs me," she cried. "He is ill. He is terrified." Elisabeth knelt beside her, praying aloud through the chaos, her voice the only calm in the storm. The door slammed, and from that moment, the queen never saw her child again. The boy, Louis Charles, the so-called Louis XVII, was placed in solitary confinement under the care of a cobbler-turned-jailer, a man chosen for his cruelty. His small cries echoed through the stone floors at night. Elisabeth pressed her ear to the wall and prayed for him until her voice gave out. Marie Antoinette sank deeper into despair. "They have killed my son already," she whispered, "but they make me live to hear it." The weeks dragged into months. The revolution outside grew bloodier, devouring its own. Every day brought news of executions, nobles, priests, even revolutionaries themselves. The guillotine had no favorites. In the temple, Elisabeth told her niece, "When men forget God, they begin to eat each other." Then, on August 1st, 1793, came the final blow. Soldiers arrived again, this time for the queen herself. They gave her no warning. She was to be taken to the Conciergerie, the dark, damp prison beneath the courts of the Revolution, the last stop before death. Marie Antoinette stood trembling, her hair uncombed, her clothes plain and gray. She turned to Elisabeth and clutched her hands. "My sister," she said, "pray for me. I go to join him." Elisabeth kissed her forehead, whispering, "We will meet there soon. Be brave, as you always have been." The queen nodded, tears streaming down her face, and was led away down the narrow staircase, her chains rattling with each step. When the sound of her footsteps faded, Elisabeth sank to her knees. The child, Marie-Thérèse, sobbed uncontrollably. "Will they kill her?" she asked. Elisabeth answered only, "They will send her to God." The Conciergerie was known as the antechamber of death. There, Marie Antoinette endured 2 months of humiliation and interrogation. The Revolutionary Tribunal accused her of every imaginable crime: extravagance, treason, even incest. The last charge, vile and absurd, wounded her most deeply. When she heard it, she rose from her seat, her face pale but resolute, and said, "Nature itself refuses to answer such an accusation made to a mother." The women in the court, even those who had hated her, began to weep. On October 16th, 1793, she was executed. They cut her hair, bound her hands, and placed her in a cart to ride through the streets of Paris. The same crowds who once cheered her beauty now hurled insults. She looked neither left nor right. Witnesses said she held her head high and prayed silently. When she stumbled on the scaffold, she apologized to the executioner. "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." Moments later, the blade fell. Back in the temple, Elisabeth knew before they told her. The air itself seemed to grow colder. That night, she folded the queen's remaining garments with care, a dress, a shawl, a few ribbons, and placed them neatly in a chest. Then she lit a candle and knelt beside it, praying aloud. "She has gone where there is no fear, no tears," she said softly. "May I soon follow her." The next morning, she tended to Marie-Thérèse as if nothing had changed. But in her heart, she understood that she was now the last guardian of of the royal line, the final embodiment of a faith and love the revolution could not understand. Paris outside roared with victory. Inside the temple, only prayer remained. The queen was gone, the king long dead, and the child slowly dying in darkness. Elisabeth's turn would come soon. She did not await it with dread, only with readiness. "They may take my life," she wrote in her final letter, "but not my soul. That belongs to the God who made me, and to the brother and sister he has already called home." Her devotion, once her shield, had become her summons. The revolution had devoured the king and the queen. Now it would come for the last light still burning quietly in the shadows. The sister who refused to flee. The woman who dared to forgive. By early 1794, the reign of terror had reached its darkest fever. France no longer wept. It screamed. The guillotine stood in the center of Paris like an altar of justice for a God who demanded endless sacrifice. Priests, nobles, peasants, even revolutionaries themselves. All were swallowed by its blade. The Republic of Virtue had turned into a slaughterhouse. And somewhere within its shadowed maze of prisons, the last daughter of the Bourbons waited in silence. Madame Elisabeth was transferred from the temple to the conciergerie, the same cold dungeon where Marie Antoinette had spent her final weeks. It was a place where hope went to die. The stone walls dripped with moisture, the straw on the floor stank of decay. Prisoners whispered prayers in the dark, measuring time not by days, but by executions. Every morning, the sound of the tumbrils, the wooden carts carrying victims to the guillotine, echoed through the corridors like a drumbeat of fate. To most, it was hell. To Elisabeth, it was a chapel. She spent her days tending to the sick, sharing her bread, and consoling those who trembled. She blessed the condemned one by one, saying softly, "We are all on the road to heaven. Only the distance differs." The guards, hardened by blood, were struck by her composure. One wrote later that she prayed as if she were already among angels. The revolutionaries did not know what to do with her. She was no queen, no conspirator, no threat. Her only crime was her name, de France. They feared her calmness, for it reminded them of what they had destroyed, innocence itself. Still, the machinery of death required victims, and her turn inevitably came. On the night before her trial, Elisabeth wrote a final letter to her niece, Marie-Thérèse, the last surviving child of the royal family. Her handwriting, though weakened by imprisonment, remained steady. "My dear child, God calls me to himself. Always think of him and of your parents. Do not hate those who make us suffer. Forgive them as I forgive. Let us meet again where no revolution can reach." When the guards came at dawn, she rose without hesitation. "Is it today?" she asked. They nodded. She smiled gently. "Then let us go, for God's will waits for no one." Her tribunal, like her brother's, was a farce of justice. The courtroom was crowded with men who had already decided her fate. She was charged with conspiracy against liberty, fanatic devotion, and attachment to tyrants. The absurdity of it all seemed almost divine comedy. To call devotion a crime and mercy an act of treason. When asked to state her name, she replied simply, "Elisabeth Marie-Hélène de France, sister of the late king." Murmurs filled the room. Even her title sounded like rebellion. The prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, demanded whether she had aided the king and queen in their plots against the Republic. "I aided them only in their prayers," she said. "If that is a crime, then I am guilty." He accused her of harboring secret correspondence, of influencing priests. of poisoning the people with superstition. She answered each charge with calm precision. I have written no letters but to heaven. I have influenced no one but by example. And I have poisoned no one, unless faith itself is poison. Her serenity unsettled even the guards. The president of the tribunal, frustrated, shouted, "Do you not fear death?" "I fear only sin," Elisabeth replied. A witness from the crowd cried out, "She is a saint!" The court ordered him removed immediately. The revolution could not afford saints. Saints make tyrants look small. The verdict was inevitable: guilty of treason against liberty. Sentence: death by guillotine within 24 hours. When the judgment was read, Elisabeth bowed her head. "May God forgive you," she said, "as I forgive you." Back in her cell, she was placed among 23 other prisoners, nobles, priests, and citizens accused of imaginary crimes. Some were sobbing, others hysterical. Elisabeth moved among them like a light through mist. She held their hands, spoke softly of heaven, and reminded them that death was but a door, not an end. Witnesses later said that her peace transformed the entire room, that by the time the guards returned, the prisoners were singing hymns. As night fell, she knelt on the cold floor and whispered her confession. "I am unworthy of such a death," she said. "But if it brings peace to France, I accept it." Dawn came gray and silent. The city, once roaring with revolution, seemed tired of its own rage. The tumbril arrived, creaking under its load of condemned souls. Elisabeth helped the others climb aboard before she took her place. She smiled as the cold wind brushed her face. On the way to the scaffold, she prayed aloud for those beside her and for France. "May this blood wash away hatred," she murmured. "May the heart of our country learn again to love." Those who watched her pass remarked on her composure. Dressed in plain white, the color of purity and mourning, she looked less like a prisoner than a bride walking toward eternity. A priest who saw her from the crowd whispered, "If this is what the Republic calls an enemy, then heaven has gained a friend." Her final hours would be remembered not for drama, but for grace. She had no defense to offer, no protest to make, only faith, unwavering, radiant, and fatal. In the eyes of her judges, Elisabeth of France was nothing but a relic of monarchy. In the eyes of those who saw her that day, she was something far greater, a soul untouched by the madness of men, standing like a pillar of mercy in a nation drowning in its own blood. The guillotine awaited, but she did not tremble. She had long since accepted what France had become and what she must become in return. Not a queen, not a martyr seeking glory, but the last living symbol of a loyalty too pure for an age that worshipped rage. Her trial was over. Her peace was not. The blade was near, but she was already halfway to heaven. Morning broke pale and cold over Paris on May 10th, 1794. The air was heavy with drizzle, the kind that seemed to weep for the dead. At the conciergerie, the guards unlocked the cell where 24 prisoners waited to die. Among them stood Elisabeth of France, calm as ever, her lips moving in silent prayer. When the door creaked open, she rose slowly, folded her blanket with care, and said to those beside her, "Courage, my friends. We go to heaven together." The others looked to her for strength. Some were trembling, others whispering frantic prayers. Elisabeth's serenity spread like light in the gloom. She helped the older women to their feet, straightened their collars, and smiled gently. Even the jailers paused, uneasy before her composure. One later confessed that he could not meet her eyes. "She looked at me," he said, as if she pitied me for living. They were herded into the tumbril, the open wooden cart used to carry the condemned. The streets, slick with rain, glistened under the gray sky. Crowds had gathered, though smaller now than before. The reign of terror had dulled even curiosity. People watched not out of hatred, but fatigue. The revolution's endless appetite had made death ordinary. Yet when they saw the young woman in the white, calm among the condemned, murmurs ran through the crowd. Some removed their hats, others bowed their heads. They recognized holiness when they saw it. As the cart jolted forward, Elisabeth clasped her rosary. Her lips moved in prayer for each prisoner by name. When one began to cry uncontrollably, she took her hand and whispered, "We shall soon see the king again, and the queen, and our Lord above them all." Her voice was so gentle that even the guards fell silent to listen. They passed the ruins of the Tuileries, once her brother's home, now a gutted shell of broken windows and scorched walls. Elisabeth looked at it without bitterness. "There," she said softly, "I learned how love can survive in chains." Then she lifted her eyes to the sky, now breaking faintly into sunlight. "Heaven has not forgotten France," she murmured. At each stop along the way, the crowd grew denser. Some shouted insults, relics of old hatred, but most were quiet. Mothers clutched their children, unable to speak. An old woman crossed herself and whispered, "God bless her." The revolutionaries nearby glared, yet said nothing. Even rage seemed small beside such peace. When the tumbril reached the Place de la Révolution, the familiar red scaffold loomed before them. The guillotine's blade, gleaming wet from the morning's use, hung high like a sword frozen in midair. The smell of blood mingled with sawdust. For most, this sight brought terror. For Elisabeth, it was release. She descended first, steady and unafraid. The executioner, Henri Sanson, later recalled that she walked as if she were entering a church. Her plain white gown brushed against the wooden steps, and the rain clung to her hair like a silver crown. She turned to help the woman behind her, saying, "Take my hand. It is but a moment." One by one, the others followed, finding courage in her calm. Before the execution began, the prisoners knelt together. Elisabeth led them in prayer. "O Lord, receive us into your peace. Forgive this country that knows not what it does." Her voice, though soft, carried across the square. Even the drummers fell silent. Then, as each name was called, the condemned approached the guillotine. They kissed the crucifix, said farewell, and mounted the scaffold. Elisabeth remained until the end, insisting that she be the last. "It is my duty," she said, "to help the others meet their death first." When the 23rd victim had fallen, she stepped forward. Sanson approached to bind her hands. She smiled faintly. "You may do your office, monsieur. I forgive you, as I hope God will forgive me." When he accidentally stepped on her foot, she said with perfect grace, "I beg your pardon, sir. I did not mean to do it." The crowd gasped. In that moment, the revolution, built on vengeance, was silenced by compassion. She mounted the scaffold, pausing only to look once toward the sky. A witness swore she whispered, "Courage, God is with us." Then she laid her head upon the block and the blade fell. It was over in an instant. No cry, no struggle, only the soft thud of the guillotine and the sound of rain beginning again. The crowd stood frozen. Even the most hardened among them felt something shift, as if they had just seen not an execution, but a consecration. One woman fainted, another whispered, "She died like a saint." The guards quickly removed the bodies to the cemetery of Picpus, where they were thrown into a mass grave without ceremony or marker. Yet those who witnessed her death would never forget the sight. The white dress, the calm eyes, the final act of forgiveness in a city drowning in hatred. That night, as the rain fell over Paris, one of the guards returned to the scaffold to clean the wood. He paused and looked up at the blade, still glistening in the moonlight. "She was braver than all of us," he murmured. Elisabeth of France had lived a life without ambition, without crown, without scandal, and died with more dignity than any monarch before her. The revolution had sought to erase her, but her final moments became immortal. In a time when men killed in the name of freedom, she had shown what true freedom was: the courage to forgive, the grace to die without hatred, and the unbroken faith that even the darkest age cannot extinguish the light of the soul. And so, on that gray morning, as the guillotine claimed her, France lost not a princess, but its last saint. When the blade fell, the crowd dispersed in silence. No cheers, no songs, only the hush that follows something sacred. Her body was thrown into a common pit at the Picpus cemetery, her name omitted from the record. The revolution buried her, as it had buried her brother and sister, beneath mud and anonymity. But history does not stay silent forever. In time, the terror ended, and those who had watched her die began to speak. They remembered the calm of her eyes, the kindness in her voice, the forgiveness that disarmed cruelty itself. Letters surfaced, witnesses testified, all telling the same truth: that Princess Élisabeth of France had met her death not as a royal, but as a saint. Years later, when peace returned to France, pilgrims came quietly to the Picpus grave. They left flowers, whispered prayers, and called her by the title she never claimed: Blessed Elisabeth. She had no crown, no throne, no tomb of marble. Yet her legacy outlived every king. In an age of rage, she chose mercy. In a world of betrayal, she chose love. And though her bones rest in an unmarked grave, her faith endures, the final flame that refused to die in the long night of the revolution.